Today, with this panel, and it is really an esteemed panel, an honor to be here on the dais with you, we're going to be talking about how the Bay Area is really doing in the smart city race to the future. What are those successes, the challenges, what are the collaboration opportunities, and how do we do this in a smarter way as a region? How do we compare to other cities or other regions across the US? And while, of course, this region likes to think of itself as a leader, are we really? And what can we do differently to really position ourselves that way as we go forward? You can see above some of the titles, but let me just, and I know people have received bios as well, but Jessi Denver, who is sitting next to me, the Energy Program Manager for the City and County of San Francisco's Department of the Environment, has an incredible history in this space. She has served before joining the City of San Francisco as the Program Director at the nation's leading solar policy, think tank, Vote Solar. She also was here in San Jose, of course, 22 years of experience really across energy policy and programs. She was San Jose's energy officer. She was at the EPA. She has taught here at San Jose State in Environmental Studies Department and also at UC Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming Jessi Denver. Gil Friend, widely considered to be one of the founders of the sustainable business movement, was named the inaugural member of the Sustainability Hall of Fame by the International Society of Sustainability Professionals and one of the 10 most influential sustainability voices in America by The Guardian. He is now the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Palo Alto. Please welcome Gil. And here in San Jose, and especially with this audience, I hope that everybody knows Shireen. Shireen Santosham is the Chief Innovation Officer for Mayor Liccardo here in San Jose. She leads the efforts to build a smart city vision and strategy for San Jose. She worked previously at GSMA and was the director in the Mobile for Development group, aiming to close the digital divide at the base of the pyramid. She also has experience with McKinsey, international NGOs, was an impact investor at Vulcan Capital. Please join me in welcoming Shireen. I am not worthy. This panel is amazing. So thank you all for taking the time to join us out of your busy schedules. I'm hoping we can just start, obviously we heard some about your work history, but just to get to know each of you, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you first become interested in this space? How did you end up doing this work? Why are you passionate about these issues? I'll start with you, Jessi.
How I got started was with a very hippie mom who raised me at Yosemite campgrounds with a solar oven. And so I've always been interested in renewable energy, which used to be called alternative technology, and was very fortunate that out of school I landed a position working with the Environmental Protection Agency and then really developed my knowledge and experience and national and international relationships here at the City of San Jose. Where we worked on renewable energy policy and program development at the perfect place and time when all of that was really starting to flourish and develop. And, you know, I'm very passionate about this after 2 decades of experience plus, because this is this incredible opportunity we have to reinvent the way we live. So writing policy on how we reinvent the way we live is exciting. And as we all know, it's totally crucial and it's fun. So it can be frustrating, but it's fun.
Yep.
I like crucial and fun. Yeah. The journey for me started fresh out of college. I spent the better part of a summer with Buckminster Fuller and the crew of the World Game Workshop, doing a deep whole systems dive, looking at energy, food, transportation, housing, education, recreation, and a half a dozen other issues within the frame of the question of how do we get a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone And it's a very grand vision, but the lesson of that, 4 weeks worth more than 4 years of university, frankly, was that we can do it. That there's no necessary physical barriers, there's no necessary resource barriers to human success on this planet for everyone. It's a question of will and politics, where we're all working, and how do we muster the will into the capability and commitment to get that stuff done. So I started there, came out of that to co-found the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a think and do tank still operating to this day, focused on urban environment and economic development. Served in Governor Brown's first administration in something he created called the Office of Appropriate Technology, which was really an innovation incubator inside of state government. And then for the previous, better part of the last few decades, I've been leading a strategy boutique called Natural Logic, working with large corporates about how do you use sustainability as a driver of innovation and exceptional economic performance. And then, to my surprise, got headhunted by the city of Palo Alto just under 5 years ago to say, what could we do here? My first reaction was, why would I want to go work for a city? That was my own naivete. And city manager Jim Keene, bless his heart, said, come and check it out. And I did, and saw there's an incredible platform, you know it well, to do both things that serve the citizens of the community. That's the primary responsibility of any city employee. But also to see the city as an incubator and a platform for change that could be a real contributor, taking advantage of its smallness, flanked by two much larger cities. We each have different strengths, and one of the strengths of Palo Alto is to be this little engine of innovation that can try things that maybe can't be tried elsewhere. Other things are better tried at larger scale, but we have a great opportunity to learn from each other and hopefully to collaborate more effectively across the region, because many of the issues we're dealing with are regional issues, not city issues.
And we're going to talk about that for sure. Srini?
Thanks. Well, it's so great to hear everybody's story, because I think a lot of people come into city government from many different paths. And for me, it was really around this intersection of believing that technology and business and the intersection between that and the public good is really impactful, and that we're at this kind of magic moment right now where technology is just going to change the way we live and work, really dramatically. And I was lucky enough early in my career, I think when I was about 24, I went and worked for Paul Allen, who was one of the co-founders of Microsoft, big visionary, big thinker in Seattle, and helped him stand up the Allen Institute for Brain Sciences, which was a $100 million institute, and really got to see the impact that you can have in a space. And then, did a number of different things, went to McKinsey, and saw lots of different kinds of business models, lots of different kind of public sector and private sector work, because I was in the DC office, and then got a job working for GSMA, which is the Mobile Phone Industry Association, and was able to do a public-private partnership with the big telcos and USAID and AusAid, and we did one of the largest scale multi-country studies on the digital divide for women globally. And that study became sort of a hallmark piece of work in that space, and led to Melinda Gates picked it up, and we had I got to speak at the UN about it, because it was so impactful about how far we were leaving people behind in terms of the digital divide. And so I really had that opportunity to look at systems change, and as I was looking at what was going on, realized cities are really where it's at. I mean, right now that's where policy meets action, and got the opportunity to work with Mayor Liccardo, and we started with literally just a piece of paper about 2 years ago, and now we have a full whole innovation and smart city team. So it's very exciting to be here.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll have enough time. We'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but we hope to get through a couple of different issues that were raised as people did their introductions there as well. That regionalism, really tackling these issues as an individual city, especially here, doesn't always make the most sense. And how are we doing that well, and how can we do that better? The cross-sector sort of partnership, private-public partnership modeling, policy, et cetera. But let's start with leadership, and I'll start with you, Shireen, just to talk a little bit about you're driving, obviously, smart city projects and programs that are transforming San Jose, the region as well, and seeking to serve as a regional or national, international model. what are some of those successes that you've had? What's most important to be thinking about in your space? Like, what don't we know that we should be thinking about? And in a broader sense, do you think that we're leaders here within this region?
Well, I think we've had a lot of success in a short period of time, but at the same time, one of the things that we started to realize early on is that we really need digital infrastructure. So infrastructure like broadband that's going to be able to help us compete in the smart city space globally. And the reality is, when I first got here and we did an assessment of San Jose, we found out we only had 3% high quality fiber in the ground. And then we worked with Stanford and had them look at low-income families in the city making less than $35,000 a year, and we found that over half of them did not have wired broadband at home. And so when you think about, all of the things that we're discussing, autonomous vehicles and this, IoT, if basic connectivity is not there, then we're all sort of in trouble. And so one of our big successes is that we built a broadband strategy, and now that we're getting substantial investment into San Jose, and just last month, we cut a deal with AT&T for small cells and 5G deployment here in San Jose. And what we've done is both earmark the money for increasing capacity in the city to speed our permitting process, as well as taking the rest of that money and put it into a digital inclusion fund that will bridge the digital divide. And I think those kinds of creative solutions are things we should really be proud of. How are we doing in the larger context, I think is the second part of your question. And I think we need to be, I think there's lots of points for optimism there, and you see, bright individuals here, but at the same time, the cost of housing is driving out talent, the commutes are driving out folks, and if you look, across the ocean to China, and you don't see those kinds of problems, and you see a lot of investment in AI, a lot of investment in hardware, and rapidly building of digital infrastructure across the country, and that does worry me a little bit.
Gil, how about from your perspective?
I would mostly echo what Shireen says. I think about the example of South Korea, and the penetration of high-speed internet as a massively pervasive available product there. We don't have that here to anywhere near the same degree. Our biggest challenges aren't technical. There's social and societal and governance, the housing issue that Shireen mentioned. I saw stats last week that said California's adding population at 10 times the rate of housing. Well, that explains a lot about our housing affordability issues, our transportation issues, and so forth. I've been dealing a lot with transportation issues. By our calculation, it's about 72% of Palo Alto's footprint. That's partly good news. We've driven down the carbon implications of our energy use from our city utility. We're doing well on green building standards for new construction. But we're a city of, 66 to 68,000 people, residents, that grows to 154,000 people during the day. Massive commuting influx. Most of that people in single occupancy, dinosaur-powered vehicles. We can't change that by ourselves. That's a regional issue. And we're in a region that has, by last count, 28 different transit operators and, 10 or 20 or 30 different agencies that have something to do with transportation policy. So we have to figure out how we can do coordinated regional planning and strategies that respect all the differences of our different constituencies, but can find some kind of coherent policy. We can't do it the way China does. We don't want to do it the way China does. But somewhere between, draconian central committee and dozens of organizations taking years to figure things out, there's got to be a better way to do this.
We're going to come back to that. I want to make sure, though, while you've got the mic, you talk a little bit about some of the successes that you've seen in your work within Palo Alto or the region, or some of those failures or challenges.
I'm happy to speak about some successes, and thank you, because it's easy to notice what's missing and forget what's done. There's been a lot of hard work. Palo Alto did its first climate action plan in 2005, one of the first in the United States. We just passed another one or a year and a half ago, setting a goal of reducing carbon emissions 80% by 2030, 20 years ahead of the state of California and the UN standard. And we're about 45% on that path now. So that's a notable success, led by City of Palo Alto Utilities, a full-service municipal utility that the city owns that in 2013, council decided to buy RECs for all of our electricity production as a bridge in a 4-year program to eliminate fossil fuels from the city's portfolio. So now we have a completely carbon neutral electricity portfolio. A year and a half ago, they decided to buy offsets for natural gas, again, as a bridge to reduce natural gas use both through efficiency and electrification. So we're on track for that. Excuse me. We've got, we think, one of the most aggressive green building policies in the state, certainly pitching ahead of the California standards, which are probably leading in the United States. So those are some notable successes, but they indicate some of the challenges. On buildings, for example, we're very strong on new construction and major renovations, but that touches maybe 1%, maybe 2% of our building stock per year. And if we wait on the natural cycles, that's a half a century or a century to transition the building stock. That doesn't work. It has to be done faster than that. It's not clear how to do that. We've made a map of the potential leverage points. All of them have political issues associated with them. And we look to our friends in the Netherlands, whose Energiesprong program is doing retrofits at scale, 20,000 units per year in Amsterdam. The Dutch, by the way, also are going to allow no new natural gas hookups after July 1st of this year. So we've done a lot that's very good, but we see other jurisdictions around the world that are taking bigger steps faster than we are politically able to do.
Jessi, let's turn to San Francisco, where, of course, the city has sought for a number of years now to really be a leader in the space that you have the privilege of leading for them. Talk about some of those successes and what you're seeing as some of the challenges. And if you look broader on a global basis, we talk about it a lot here that San Francisco is leading, but where else do you see bright lights or people who we can learn from?
Sure. Well, like both of my colleagues here have noted, city government is really where you can create change and effective change. Having had worked at the federal level and coordinated with folks at the state and then spent time at city government, I mean, we're all very committed to it because it is really where you can create change. And San Francisco, of course, has been a longtime leader in audacious policy around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not that, oh, it's San Francisco, and so, of course, San Francisco is going to put policies in place that are different and more progressive than other cities. We're actually proving that those policies work. So like Gil, we had an 80% GHG emission reduction below 1990 level goal, which in April we changed to carbon neutrality by 2050. And to date, the policies that we've put in place to support these goals have actually resulted in a 29% reduction in GHG emissions below our 1990 levels, and that's at the same time that our GDP has increased by 111% and our population has increased by 20%. So we're really proving that these types of thoughtful policy that reinvent the way we live works, and that a good, robust economy and population go hand in hand. And we're learning how to do that from our colleagues worldwide. We're a part of international networks of cities, and we all talk to each other and coordinate, and we even get together for like week-long retreats, depending on the network that you're a member of, to figure out what we all need to tackle that next year and how collectively we're going to do it and learn from each other. Just a few examples of where San Francisco's at on some of our major policy objectives. We have a zero waste goal. We have an 80% sustainable trips goal. So that's ensuring that all trips made into and within San Francisco are done by walking, biking, and public transportation. Today we're at 54%. So, our transit first policy and prioritizing transit first as a goal is also working. We have a 100% renewable energy goal by 2030. In San Francisco, we have 2 utilities, a municipal-owned utility like Palo Alto, as well as PG&E, and we also have a CCA program, Clean Power SF. And between our 2 utilities, the grid today is 44% renewable. So this, in turn, offers this terrific opportunity for us to then say, okay, for all the cars and trucks that remain on our streets, we need to electrify those, and we need to optimize the use of renewable energy on the grid to do that so that we can get to this 20 by 50 carbon neutrality goal. So, there's a lot working in San Francisco, and there's a lot of successes there. And like Gil noted, we look to our colleagues in the Netherlands. We're actually bringing a form of energy sprung to California. We worked through a Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance grant with Rocky Mountain Institute over the last couple years, and that has then turned into a larger grant via the California Energy Commission, actually in conjunction with Prospect Silicon Valley, so that grant was just awarded. So Energy Sprung version 2.0 is coming to the Bay Area soon. But I think one of the things for cities to start looking at that I know Gil and I are very active in the conversations both nationally and worldwide is around thermal decarbonization and getting natural gas out of the system. So I think that's one of the next hurdles to tackle that's going to require a lot of policy and innovation.
Let's come back to that as well, because I want to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing and the future. But I'd like to go back to what you were talking about, Gil, about regionalism. As folks in the room may know, we've got 50 school districts. We've got, as Gil mentioned, 28 public transportation agencies in this region, many of which are not well coordinated with each other. We've got police and fire in every city working separately. It is, though, now, of course, the case that there are not orchards in between each of these cities like they used to be. You can have visitors come and just drive San Francisco down to San Jose and not realize when they're in a different city and why it wouldn't all work together, like why that doesn't make sense. When we're talking now about sustainability, about energy, as we have today, you can't separate those from transportation. I mean, you can't work on those issues without thinking about these broader regional connectivity challenges. And so I wonder, and let me just say quickly, the Community Foundation had a symposium. They have an annual conference, and I think it was 2 years ago where they brought together the city managers from San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, I believe, and they said, how often are you meeting? How often are you guys connecting? And 2 of them said, this is actually the first time we've ever met in person. And so we know this is a critical point in the challenge of addressing so many of the issues that we've talked about today within this region. What needs to happen? What's working, what's not, and what needs to change to move the Bay Area forward? And why don't we start with you, Gil, since you raised it?
Okay, you're going to make us earn our pay this afternoon, aren't you? Tough nut for historical reasons and cultural reasons as well as governance reasons. Local control is a very important notion in the United States, different than in other countries. We recognize that there are benefits of economy of scale, of dealing with at larger scale with larger institutions, but we also know that innovation comes in a very different way out of small institutions. You see that with Shireen's office and other, and the work that San Francisco has done, which is leapfrog national policy again and again and again. And so, there are always trade-offs when you try to collaborate. So there's that challenge. There's, let's be indelicate, let's talk about turf and identity and history. For all of us, this is one of the challenges of democracies, is that our local elected officials are accountable to local constituencies which have local concerns, often very strongly held, and it's challenging to get people to zoom out and look at the larger issues. So that said, on the other hand, we have a lot of intergovernmental institutions in the Bay Area, MTC, ABAG, BACMUD, transportation organizations, joint powers authorities and so forth. They function very well in many ways, but it's a complex ecosystem with lots and lots of overlap. It generates a certain kind of richness and effectiveness, and there's a trade-off in terms of agility, ability to focus, and the speed at which we move. And that's one that concerns me very much. We have a different challenge in Palo Alto than my colleagues on the side. We're a strong city manager, weak mayor form of government. So you don't get the same kind of stand-up leadership that a Mayor Liccardo or Mayor Newsom could have done. Where somebody says, I'm going to put something out and we'll see what happens. We are much more of a consensual, develop ideas internally, refine them, find some agreement, and that has great strengths because you build agreement that people will support, but it's harder to see the kind of bold leadership that we've seen in a number of cities in the United States around the world with a strong mayor kind of government. So those are some first thoughts. I'll add one more thing to that. We've stepped into this question fairly forthrightly around transportation in two ways. One is that a year ago, we instituted what we call a manager's mobility partnership, which brings together the city managers of Redwood City, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and Mountain View, plus the transportation team from Stanford, on a monthly basis to talk about shared transportation issues and looking at things that we can do together as multiple cities, because like you say, the boundaries are sort of arbitrary between us. Functionally, we need to work together on that. And then secondly, we just kicked off yesterday a project funded by the Federal Transit Administration out of their Mobility Sandbox program to pilot a series of new mobility initiatives with a handful of large employers, both public and private, in the Mid-Peninsula. So on its face, that's about ride sharing, first and last mile, new mobility aggregation apps. But we are hoping, and the Federal Transit Administration is hoping, that one of the outcomes of this is a perspective on how we collaborate more effectively regionally, both in the work we do together and perhaps even in the posture that we take together to Sacramento, because some of the solutions are going to have, or some of the enabling for some of the solutions will probably have to come from there.
Shireen, San Jose is, of course, the heart of Silicon Valley, as is often said. What does that mean for your work in building a smart city vision, and how do you think about the regional nature of some of the challenges you're addressing?
Sure. I think I'd first say, we all play a role, and that seems trite, but it's really quite true. And actually, San Jose is a city manager-led form of government, so it's unusual. We're only one of two big cities in the country that have that format, and that takes a lot of consensus building. And so the leadership of Mayor Liccardo to build consensus around the table with 10 council members has been quite remarkable in the ability of us to get things done. And so, leadership is really important at the government level, but I'd also say, leadership from our corporate community is very important because frankly, the corporate community can think about some of these issues that were sort of handcuffed on jurisdiction, and their employees, live in different cities and commute to their campus and want to, for people are mobile, people are regional. This is a regional job market. It's not a static job market. And so, the jobs housing imbalance across the Bay Area can cause challenges. San Jose has more people at night than they do during the day because we're a bedroom community. So many people live here and commute to other areas, but much of the business tax revenue stays locally, right? So that's a challenge when we're housing so many people, but the jobs revenue is going to a different jurisdiction, right? And I think the challenges that the corporate community sees their employees facing, they can show some real leadership and help usher collaboration amongst the jurisdictions. And I think that's very powerful and should not be underestimated. And then, having honest conversations about changing the way that, folks personally live and work and taking public transit and making options for themselves there. But that also means we need to make those options more attractive. and that's an important role. And at the state level, you see a lot of collaboration with big cities coming together in California and working together on, RM3 and some of these other large initiatives. And so I think all of that is positive, but it certainly, is not moving at the pace that we probably would like.
There, of course, is a lot of conversation about how, especially down here, about how a bunch of the Silicon Valley has moved up into San Francisco, the impact that it's having on every aspect of life in the city. I wonder how, from your perspective, you're thinking about regionalism.
My little button thing keeps coming off every time I push it. I highlighted what our GHG emissions look like, and my team is a distributed energy resource team, so we work on efficiency, renewables, storage, and zero-emission vehicle policy and program development and implementation. And so when we're looking at where the biggest part of our footprint is, it is the transportation sector footprint. And for us, transportation's been a really stubborn sector. Since 1990, we've only reduced emissions 11%, and in the last few years, we've actually seen those emissions go up. And transportation overall represents 45% of the city's GHG emissions, and that is primarily from private sector, cars and trucks. Unlike other cities, it's not our public transportation infrastructure, because our Muni system, including our buses that have overhead lines, our entire Muni streetcar system, underground historic trolleys, all run on our municipal GHG-free hydroelectricity and have done so for over 100 years. And the buses that we have that are not powered by electricity run on 100% renewable diesel, and we've just committed to purchasing a full electric bus trolley fleet. So it's not our public transportation infrastructure that's the issue. And so when we look at the 600,000 vehicles that are operating on city streets every day, there's about 430,000 of those are registered in the city and county of San Francisco. There's about 33,000 medium and heavy duty vehicles coming in and out. And then there's about 135,000 inbound commuter vehicles. And then we have about 75,000 of the registered vehicles in San Francisco that are actually outgoing to your communities. And none of the numbers that I just gave you then include on top of that the about 35,000 transportation network company entrepreneurial drivers that are operating in San Francisco on a daily basis. So this is a regional issue for us when we're trying to solve for zero-emission vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure. We can do a lot of work in San Francisco to make sure that that infrastructure is available to our residents, businesses, and commuters, but if those solutions are also not being put into place on the other end, it doesn't allow for consumers, residents of the Bay Area, to have that assurance that there's reliable, convenient charging infrastructure or refueling infrastructure in the case of fuel cell electric vehicles where they live versus where they work and how they get around. And then, of course, we have the transit first policy, so ensuring that those kind of regional solutions are also in place is very important. And one of the things that we've seen around charging infrastructure specifically and kind of the approaches to charging infrastructure that the state has taken is this idea that one size fits all for every community around charging infrastructure. That hierarchy or loading order of how you charge a car, first at home, then at the workplace, then kind of destination charging. And I'm going to focus my comments specifically on zero-emission vehicles. That's kind of the order in which you should prioritize charging infrastructure. But in San Francisco, 70% of our population lives in multi-unit dwellings. A third of the cars that we have are parked in multi-unit dwellings, and another third are parked on the street. So we actually need to flip the loading order of charging to have a dense network of DC fast chargers available. Then, comes where else you can put them in off-street locations. And so, I think that the regional collaboration that needs to happen among cities to understand where vehicles are coming and going, and then where they're dwelling, and how those vehicles are supported at either end at different times of the day is really, really important. And we've started to partner with our colleagues. For example, we worked with Fremont and Oakland through a California Energy Commission grant to develop our EV readiness ordinances for new construction and major renovations. So this is a REACH code beyond what the state mandates. We were, of course, a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation Smart Cities Challenge a couple years ago, where we were one of the 7 national finalists. And one of the lessons that we learned from that effort, which was one of the hardest things I've ever worked on in a very short period of time, was the need for collaboration. As Gil was saying, we all are very competitive, and yet we're all colleagues, and we all work together. But on grant funding, especially, because a lot of the work that we do needs to come from grants, we just don't have money. That we start partnering instead of competing. That way we can get more done. We all each might not get as much out of the grant opportunity, but at least we can start to move the needle to create that change that needs to happen. So I think that we're seeing that paradigm shift among cities and starting to understand, wow, if we go at this together, we'll probably get more out of it than if we try to go at it alone. And the approach of going at it alone doesn't work anyways if the end-to-end solutions aren't there.
Great, thank you. Shireen, I'd love to come back to you to talk a little bit about the public-private partnership priority and modeling that you were talking about. At Microsoft, I lead a team of people working across cities to think about that broader sort of smart city vision and how to implement that. And what we see is that while before that the responsibility was really seen to be a particular sector, different depending on which issue, now almost every issue needs to be multi-sector, and you see coalitions coming together that include startups and business and government and nonprofits and academia to tackle any one of these things. I wonder, from your perspective in San Jose, as you've set up the vision, how important is this? I know just in this room we have people from startups that are working in this space, from large companies, from government agencies, et cetera. How do you think about public-private partnerships? What's working? Can you give us some examples of things that you've done in San Jose? And what's not? Like, what do we need to do to make this gel in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, we have a long history of strong public-private partnerships in San Jose, so I won't take credit for all of the things that have happened over many, many years. But we do have what's very unique across cities in the country, which is a demonstration policy that allows us to work with private sector companies on basically pre-commercial products for a certain amount of time for them to, test and have access to some city resources and infrastructure or otherwise. And so under that policy, we have a backhaul network from Facebook called Facebook Telegraph. That's essentially a millimeter wave solution. We have recently one of the big challenges that we face is citizen engagement, especially at the local government level. And, it's hard to get people to understand how important the decisions are that are happening. And so we're pilot testing a smart video AI solution from Box that actually takes, we're doing it in one of our committees, the Smart Cities Committee. And what it'll do is it'll take after committee meeting's over, it'll intake a video, and it takes about 2 minutes to process every 1 minute of video, and then it automatically recognizes voices and faces of folks, and can tag where they have spoken, and then automatically transcribes it, and then you can search for what has this council member said on this topic in this region, and it completely sort of changes accessibility of information for residents if it works. And so it's still a beta product, but it's really important to us to take all of these new tools and utilize them. And we also did something very simple, which was we took our city council committee meeting and put it on Facebook Live. And we got literally 30 times the viewership of any other meeting that we had had. And it was a simple solution, and it probably sounds pretty silly to folks that say, like, why couldn't you just do that? But there's actually a lot of legal reasons why we can't and why other cities haven't done it, but we just found a way through that. And, so I think solving problems takes creativity and a lot of input from different types of stakeholders, startups, businesses, and we really aren't going to solve the challenges that we're facing if we're not creative. But at the same time, it can be really difficult. And so even with this demonstration agreement, it can take a lot longer than we want to push through some of these projects. It can take, like Facebook Live, I think took me almost a year to get that through. And because of just how much we are sometimes our own enemy in the process. And so how do you think about reforming procurement? How do you think about adjusting so you can be flexible to really meet the needs of today? And so incredibly important. We're working on it. It's a process of continuous improvement, but I fundamentally feel very hopeful about it.
Gil or Jessi, you want to chime in on public-private partnerships?
Yeah, they're critical because there are things that that cities just can't do themselves or can't do fast enough or don't have the expertise to do. We have a similar pilot program primarily through Palo Alto Utilities called Program for Emerging Technologies, which does a similar kind of co-development. Clearly focused more around energy and water technologies, but we've also done some partnerships with Stanford around sensor technology, really finding ways to pilot. The challenge that Shireen talked about the cadence of life in city government is one that's been very challenging to me, coming to this from private sector. But we've done a little bit of interesting experimentation there. In relation to electric vehicle charging, we spent probably 6 months debating at the staff level how to price electric vehicle charging, and finally realized that we were just a bunch of people with opinions, and nobody knew the right answer. So we went to council with an unusual request. We would normally say, here's a pricing structure, please approve it. And we went instead and said, here's the elements of a pricing structure: a drop fee, a per kilowatt hour charge, and a squatter charge. If you overstay, you're welcome. And we proposed a range of prices for each of them and asked council to approve the range and give staff the authority to modify pricing without having to come back to council, which we'll do, I guess probably this fall after a year of data, and come back with actual data. So the notion was to shift from spending 2 years analyzing something, a year socializing and getting it approved, 6 months or a year getting it up and running, a year to run it, and 4 or 5 year learning cycle, which doesn't make sense in a world where technologies are changing, on a monthly basis or sometimes a weekly basis. So we built here a 6 to 9 month learning cycle as an experiment. And council went for it, and we'll bear the fruits of it this fall. So I think, there's two elements in your question, Sid. One is the public-private partnership, and the other is how we start to develop a kind of agility in city government that can, not exactly match, but at least work more effectively with the agility in the private sector. We need to be able to experiment and learn fast, and as we folks talk about in the private sector, to fail fast. And the challenge, as someone talked about this morning, I guess it was the mayor talked about it this morning, is that failure is not a very comfortable idea in public sector. Elected officials are going to get beat up for failure. We all work with the board. I have a board essentially of 66,000 people looking at everything I do, and it's very easy to not be flawless, especially when you're trying new things. And so if we have a culture where every failure or every defect is jumped on, we're going to have a hard time innovating. So how do we shift that culture and allow not infinite room for failure, because we're ultimately fiduciaries of the public trust and the public monies, but how do we have room to experiment and try things, knowing that in a portfolio strategy, some things will work and some things will not work, and on balance, that should be okay if you balance the portfolio well.
Jessi?
So I was here when San Jose passed its demonstration policy, and every day with the city of San Francisco, I miss San Jose's demonstration policy. We don't have anything like that, and from my perspective, failure is a data point that enables us to understand then how we pivot to continue moving forward. But Gil is right that that's kind of not everyone's perspective on whether you succeed or fail in city government. And what I would say around kind of public-private partnerships is that the private sector doesn't understand how important it is to proactively partner with the public sector. And the emergence of e-scooters in San Francisco city streets is a perfect recent example of that, where they showed up and they were everywhere, but there was no permitting system in place. And so a lot of steps backwards needed to be taken to then allow this emerging mobility solution to be tested on public streets and understand how it fits within a system. Taking that to kind of a zero emission vehicle level, we're currently engaged with a number of charging infrastructure providers to deploy charging infrastructure at city facilities. In San Francisco, because we don't have a lot of real estate like some other cities, and curbside charging in San Francisco, we don't know what that looks like. We're going to need to do a really in-depth analysis and feasibility study to determine if charging infrastructure in the public right-of-way is even something that we're willing to do, because we do have transit-first policies and other priorities with that piece of real estate. We really need to look to off-street solutions. And so looking at our own municipal facilities, working with commercial property owners who have parking garages and trying to help them reinvent what the commercial parking garage business model looks like, with an integration of charging as a service, both in the interim for electric vehicles and for the onset of autonomous vehicles. One of the things that I hear consistently when I go to conferences, and even with the last panel, which was a great conversation around autonomous vehicles, is this kind of thought process that electric vehicles and AVs are a transportation-only issue. And I think that's really incorrect. And that's why from the city of San Francisco's perspective, we look at zero-emission vehicles as an energy issue as much as a transportation issue, because you need to ensure that charging infrastructure and the electrical capacity of the grid on a block-by-block basis, in conjunction and partnership with the local utility, that whole system is well organized and coordinated. And so again, the private sector who's innovating on technology needs to always have in mind that local government, especially local governments that have municipal utilities, that is going to be critical to partner with local governments ahead of time if they want to see their technology deployed and tested in an accelerated fashion. And the last point I would make is we're going to embark on developing a citywide EV roadmap for private sector transportation and implementation plan. We just received a California Energy Commission grant to produce these documents. And we're going to bring together a robust subcommittee of internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders from industry, regional, and state agencies, including the governor's office, nonprofit organizations. And so that kind of, collaborative approach to how you solve solutions then helps the private sector understand where our internal barriers are, as well as helps us understand what the private sector's motivations are.
And I know Gil has a follow-up, and then we're going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. So get those ready if you have one. Gil?
Yeah, thanks, Sid. I think it's important that we acknowledge the responsibility of the public sector. in the public-private partnership gap. I mean, the scooters appeared on the streets of San Francisco and other cities because those companies decided that it was going to be a lot less headache to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. No, is that a right decision or not? I don't know, but their perception was that there were barriers from the cities that would have made it impossible to develop that business in any reasonable amount of time. Lyft and Uber have gotten a lot of criticism for being unfair to transit systems and unfair to taxi companies, but the fact is that the transit systems and the taxi companies, which could have done those innovations, didn't. And so, again, we have a mismatch of the innovation and agility that if cities want to partner effectively, we have to find some better ways to do that, to be able to match speed and give space. And the real challenge, I think, is how do we do this kind of deliberative process that includes all stakeholders and yet still has some urgency to it? It's a tough question.
Yep. Let's turn to the audience.
My name is Raj. Work at Duke Energy, Charlotte, North Carolina. So the question for panel is, when you look at the cities, one of the issues is affordability, right? The cost of living and all that, which is pretty high in Bay Area or even Seattle and compared to other cities. So my question is, energy is more of a necessity, and then it's all great, just talking about sustainability, but also how about making this, or what are the efforts that the cities are taking to make these cities affordable for the other 50% of the population, or the ones that are on the low end of the income, that are having their hard time making their ends meet, meaning not necessarily not a lot of disposable income, but when you actually think about the energy prices and other things getting higher and higher with this thing, that's a possibility, not every time, but more importantly, how do we make this affordable by also looking at sustainability, and can we do both? And what are the cities doing to make that affordability a thing for everybody?
I'll start. I'll say that I'm not as concerned about energy affordability. We have our carbon neutral electricity at I don't know what the current numbers are. I think 15 or 18% below PG&E's prices. The cost of renewables and storage are coming down rapidly, so that doesn't concern me as much. The cost of housing very much does. Palo Alto, I think, everybody will agree we're not doing a very good job on housing affordability, but it's not a uniquely Palo Alto issue. It's a housing policy in California issue. And I think one of the places where that comes to a point in cities is that we treat energy and housing and transportation and other issues as separate issues handled in separate departments. They're the same issue. Housing and transportation can't be separated. It's very difficult for us institutionally to deal with them together. I think that's one of the things we have to break. The other, which is a question for you all as well as for us, is that this is very much a political question. And in many jurisdictions in California, the residents don't want more housing, even though there's enormous pressure for housing. It's politically tough. It's tough for the electeds to deal with that. It's tough for the communities to reconcile it. Feelings run very hot on this stuff, and it's something we have to figure out. We have not figured it out, but it's a looming challenge to the state as a whole, not just to our communities here.
Question here. We've been talking about leadership, and these disruptive technologies can be force for good, but they can also be disruptive in the other way and create a lot of social chaos, particularly with regards to, say, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, displacement of marginally economic people. So I think that there's a certain responsibility that needs to hit the radar. It's beyond the scope of this conference, but I just want to give a shout out to the potential disruption nature of economically of the things we're supporting and developing here. And also, I think people may have heard about Andrew Yang's book about War on Normal People and that realistic assessment that he has about the wave of automation disruption that could really make major social disruption and make it a lot harder for us to accomplish the goals we're talking about. So I think that should be on people's radar. It's a larger scale, but I think it's a big part of the picture here that we need to deal with the people outside this tech bubble and who are going to be displaced by all the stuff that we're talking about here. So you speak to that. I just wanted to give it a little shout out and put it on the radar. Thank you.
Great point. Shireen, response?
I think it's spot on to talk about that issue. And I haven't read the book, but certainly we're entering into a very interesting point in history where the acceleration of technologies is happening faster, and most likely it will displace many people. And we're not having a strong enough conversation, I think, here in the Valley or in general on the national stage about it. People sort of talk about it in general terms, but not really sort of diving into how do we address it. And I think that it's important we detangle that a little bit. So one thing is when a new technology company really disrupts an industry. So for example, Uber, when they came in to San Jose, and then our airport lost like a substantial amount of parking revenue, right? And so that changed kind of the dynamic for the airport, and it changed, taxi sector and all of these things. And so, there's sort of a point at which a company gets big enough that they are sort of affecting the whole ecosystem, and that you've got to start addressing that question. And many times, I'd say startups don't want to really have to deal with that question until it's almost like a little too late. And so being proactive about thinking about those questions early on is really important. And things like, data sharing around autonomous vehicles, like it's very important for transportation planning purposes. And, the idea that you can never share data because it's competitively yours. I mean, those kinds of things are not going to be sustainable in the long term, because you have to, you exist in kind of this ecosystem and society. And so I think it's really important that on the corporate side that we start having a more honest conversation there, so that we can really be proactive about it, and also understanding the value that government is bringing. So despite all of the bureaucratic challenges that it can bring to work with local government or state or federal government, the reality is that there's a lot of expertise there in dealing with the public and helping the public through these transitions. And so understanding that there's value in not trying to just work around and put stuff on streets or whatever, getting rid of all of those checks and balances around sort of managing public assets and public good is not going to be the way that we close that equity gap. In fact, we'll just leave folks farther behind.
I'll just highlight as well, I was at a conference recently, and you can debate the numbers. I know we talked about some of them today, where everybody excited about autonomous vehicles, and somebody stood up and said, I'm excited as well. I work in this space. I'm from the middle of the country, though, and I have to tell you, like, what we talk about there is the fact that there are 3 million people who work in this country in something related to trucking or taxis, et cetera, who you are all telling me in 10 years will be out of a job. Who is thinking about those people? Like, where is the policy planning for reskilling 3 million people in this country? And that's just one industry, let alone people who work at checkout stands who won't need those. I mean, where with rapid change, where is the broader policy discussion about how we move as a society to deal with these impacts before we're in a crisis mode? And I think you saw some of the reaction to that reality in the last election. You had a response to that.
Yeah, and I would just add that local governments are thinking about that. Local governments, cities are, responsible for workforce and economic development and training, and work closely with different types of training programs and our city colleges. Just around kind of zero emission vehicles, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. We all applied for some grant funding that we didn't get, but we're waiting for another opportunity to actually do an assessment of what is that potential impact in the whole ecosystem associated with just zero emission vehicle market transformation, and then the eventual autonomous vehicle, and who do we need to upskill, who do we need to train, how do we get people into those educational and workforce opportunities, because that is a huge issue that nobody is talking about yet. And this incredible opportunity to also provide, from an equity perspective, these new opportunities to get kids right out of high school into really good paying jobs. So yeah, that's an important thing that we are thinking about and that needs to be addressed.
And it's huge.
All right. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's huger than huge and maybe beyond the scale of cities to handle, because it's not just truck drivers and taxi drivers, it's car mechanics, it's parking lots, it's car dealerships, it's insurance companies. You know, Tony Seba at Stanford projects that we're going to have 80% fewer cars in the United States by 2030. Interesting book called Clean Disruption. Now, I don't know if his numbers are exactly right, but if they're directionally right, that's a massive disruption rippling through. I mean, the automobile industry is 1/6 of our economy. So this is not just a disruption, this is an avalanche, as Fernando Flores would call it. And it's, you know, it's very big. It will take a national response. We're not going to see a national response anytime soon. So what we do at the city level is bridging and, you know, and first aid. And we'll have in some places some very beneficial and innovative drivers, but we're not going to solve it at our scale.
I feel like we're just getting into it, and we have reached our time. So my apologies to others who had questions, but I know people will be here to take them afterwards. I hope you will join me in thanking all of our panelists, and thank you everyone for staying.